So today we are embarking on an in-depth examination of, well, one of the most compelling and tragic stories in modern American sports and legal history, the case of Rubin Hurricane Carter.
It really is. Carter was a middleweight boxer, and he was known for this relentless, incredibly aggressive style in the ring. He truly earned that nickname, Hurricane.
He absolutely did. But his legacy, as you and I know, is tragically defined not by his wins, not by the knockouts, but by the 18 years and 4 months he spent unjustly incarcerated.
Wrongfully convicted of murder.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the sources that we've compiled really trace his entire life. We see everything from a pretty troubled youth to that explosive boxing career, and then, of course, through to deeply, deeply flawed trials.
And then finally to his remarkable post-release advocacy.
Exactly.
Our focus in this examination is really to try and cut through a lot of the noise. I mean, there's celebrity involvement, there's mythology that's built up around this case. We want to extract the essential facts, the legal chronology.
Yeah, we need to understand the shifting testimonies, the failures of the police, and, the prosecution across not one, but two separate trials.
Two trials. And then the
Yeah.
specific, very powerful judicial ruling that finally secured his freedom. We're really going to trace his path from the heights of being a title contender all the way to the depths of a jail cell.
And then back out again, to his eventual and really impactful role as a global advocate for the wrongly convicted.
So just to set the foundation, a timeline is probably crucial here.
Absolutely. Rubin Carter was born in Clifton, New Jersey on May 6, 1937. His period of wrongful imprisonment, it begun with that first conviction in 1967. And it doesn't end until his release in November of 1985.
18 years.
We are looking at a system that kept an innocent man incarcerated for almost 2 decades. He passed away on April 20th, 2014. But that nearly 20-year time frame, that struggle, that is the central axis of his entire story.
Okay, so let's unpack this life. Let's start with the origins of the man who would become the Hurricane. He was the fourth of 7 children, and the source material outlines a pretty challenging, often conflicted environment.
Very much so. Specifically, there are clear references to a deeply troubled relationship with his father. His father was described as a strict, sometimes even harsh, disciplinarian.
And that early life, it was marked by conflict that seems to have escalated pretty quickly into confrontations with the law.
It did. By the age of just 11, he was sentenced to a juvenile reformatory. And the initial incident, it was severe. It was an assault involving stabbing a man who, according to Carter's own account, had allegedly attempted to sexually assault him.
Right, and this is such a profound moment because it immediately places him into the system, into incarceration, into reform, and it really defines the cycle that he would then spend decades trying to break.
That's the perfect word for it, a cycle. A cycle of institutionalization and, well, rebellion. He didn't stay in the reformatory consistently. In 1954, he escapes.
And he joins the army.
He joins the United States Army, maybe seeking structure, maybe just a fresh start. He completes basic training, gets sent overseas to West Germany. And it's there, while he's serving, that he first discovers boxing. He starts boxing for the Army.
But even that military environment, which is, designed for discipline, it ultimately proved incompatible with his temperament at the time.
Totally incompatible. The records show he was discharged in 1956 as unfit for service.
Yeah.
And this was after being subjected to 4 separate courts-martial during his just 2 years of service. 4. It just points to a young man who was operating completely outside of the established boundaries. He just couldn't conform.
And the moment he gets back home, that cycle you mentioned just repeats itself.
Instantly. He's convicted of 2 muggings shortly after his discharge, and he's sent right back to prison.
So it wasn't until his release from this particular stint, which was in September of 1961, that he finally focused all of that aggression, that strength, into a professional boxing career.
Yeah, and when he stepped into that professional ring, you have to remember, he was physically undersized for a middleweight. He's standing at 5'8", fighting around 155, maybe 160 pounds.
Not a big guy for that class.
No, but what he lacked in height, he just compensated for with ferocious, relentless pressure. His style was so aggressive, characterized by this incredible punching power. It often led to these really rapid, technical knockouts.
And that's where the name comes from.
That sheer force and speed of attack is exactly what earned him the moniker that stuck, Hurricane.
And this is where the analysis of his rise gets really compelling because the trajectory was incredibly swift. By 1963, he was a known quantity. He's defeating real middleweight contenders, guys like Florentino Fernandez, George Benton.
Right, in the Ring magazine, which was, the definitive publication in boxing at the
What
time.
level of boxing?
It was. They listed him in their top 10 middleweight contenders by July of 1963. He was electrifying audiences. People were really taking notice.
The single most important victory of his career had to be the TKO over Emil Griffith, December 20th, 1963.
Oh, absolutely. Griffith was a massive name, a past and future world champion. For Carter to not just beat him, but to floor him twice in the very first round.
In the first round.
It was a monumental achievement. That win immediately catapulted him to being ranked as the #3 contender for the world middleweight title. It positioned him as a legitimate threat to the absolute best in the world.
And that win, of course, earned him the title shot. On December 14th, 1964, he faces Joey Giardello in Philadelphia. It's for the world middleweight title, a 15-round championship bout.
And the sources describe a very, very tight fight. Carter lands some powerful rights early on, particularly in the 4th round, that left Giardello clearly shaken, but he couldn't close the deal.
He couldn't finish it.
No. And Giardello, being the seasoned champion he survives that early barrage, he adjusts his strategy, and he really takes control of the fight from the 5th round onward. He basically nullified Carter's aggression.
And the result was a unanimous decision loss for Carter.
It was. And that fight remains pretty controversial in some boxing circles. Many believe the decision was questionable, given the dominance Carter showed in those early rounds. But officially, it was a loss, and it significantly derailed his upward momentum.
It really did. The sources show a marked decline right after that title loss. He fought 9 times in 1965, and while he won 5 of those, he started losing against the top-tier contenders. He lost to Luis Manuel Rodriguez and, maybe most painfully, to Dick Tiger.
The Dick Tiger match was a physical disaster for Carter. I mean, Tiger was an elite boxer, and he floored Carter 3 times during that fight. It was a punishing, comprehensive defeat.
And Carter's own reflection on it really speaks volumes.
It does. He called it, and this is a quote, "the worst beating that I took in my life, inside or outside the ring." This wasn't just a loss. It was an admission that his powerful but maybe technically flawed aggressive style was vulnerable at the highest levels.
So that period really marks the rapid winding down of his career. His final professional outing was a points decision loss on August 5, 1966, just weeks before the incident that would forever change his life.
His final professional record, for context, stands at 40 fights. He had 27 wins, 19 by knockout or TKO, 12 losses, and 1 draw. A short, explosive career, just cut off prematurely by a horrific crime.
Right, and it's so important for the listener, to internalize this context. By June of 1966, Carter was a recognizable, locally famous, but recently declining athlete in Paterson, New Jersey.
And his history was defined by early violence, trouble with authority, and this aggressive public persona, which tragically just made him an easy target when law enforcement needed quick answers to a horrifying crime.
Okay, so let's turn to that night, the night of June 17, 1966. Around 2:30 in the morning, a brutal triple homicide occurs at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson. And the source material, it paints a very clear picture of just total devastation.
Yes, the violence was absolute. The bartender, James Oliver, and a customer, Fred Niox, were both killed instantly. A third customer, Hazel Tanis, she died a month later from her wounds. She'd been hit by the blast of a 12-gauge shotgun.
And there was a 4th victim.
A 4th victim, Willie Marions, who survived but was permanently blinded in one eye. The specific weapons used were identified as a .32 caliber pistol and a 12-gauge shotgun. But here's a key detail. Neither weapon was ever found. Not at the scene, not linked conclusively to any suspect.
And that detail is just so critical for understanding the subsequent investigation. The weapons were never recovered. The timeline of the police response, the initial encounters with Carter.
Yeah.
It's equally critical because it just exposes the procedural errors that began immediately.
Exactly. About 10 minutes after the murders, roughly 2:40 a.m., a police cruiser stops a white rental car near the bar. Inside of the Carter, who's in the back seat, John Artis is driving, and a third man, John Royster.
And Carter's a known figure.
He's recognized by the officers. He was local celebrity, controversial or not. And based on that initial recognition, and maybe a lack of immediate suspicion, the police just gabled her. They allowed them to leave.
So Carter and Artis then drop off Royster, but less than an hour later, around 3 a.m., the same car, now just with Carter and Artis, is stopped again near the bar.
This time they're arrested. They're taken to the station. So the question is, what changed in that brief window? And the answer is very little, except maybe the realization by the police of the gravity of the crime they were dealing with.
Right. The entire foundation of the state's case was built on eyewitness accounts, and this is where the prosecution's troubles really begin.
They absolutely do. The two surviving victims who could speak, Oliver and Marins, they told police the shooters were black males, but crucially, never identified Carter or Artis as the perpetrators.
So the case ends up hinging on the testimony of two other key witnesses, Alfred Bello and Patricia Valentine. And Bello's testimony, well, it was compromised from the very beginning by his own criminality.
Bello's account was fundamentally dishonest. I mean, he initially claimed he was just entering the bar to buy cigarettes when he discovered the bodies. He later confessed to the police, and this is a key fact the prosecution would later use as leverage, that he was actually serving as a lookout.
A lookout for an accomplice?
For his accomplice, Arthur Bradley, who was breaking into a nearby warehouse. And in a really grotesque detail, the sources note that Bello admitted he took money from the cash register while the victims were lying there, just moments after the shooting.
So you have a key witness who is not only a liar about the core circumstances of his presence, but he's also a thief who leveraged a tragedy for his own personal gain.
Yet his subsequent trial testimony was instrumental. He claimed he saw two black males leave the bar and drive away in a white car. He eventually identified Artis.
Okay, now let's look at Patricia Valentine. She lived above the bar. Her description of the getaway car was equally problematic, right?
It was. Both she and Bello reportedly described the car as white, but with a highly unusual feature, a geometric design, sort of a butterfly-type design in the back. Valentine initially described the rear lights as lighting up completely like butterflies. This detail seemed very unique.
And this is one of those pieces of evidence that you, the listener, need to scrutinize really closely. Carter was driving a rental car that was white. It did not have butterfly-shaped taillights that illuminated fully.
No, what it had was conventional taillights, but with an aftermarket detail. Aluminum butterfly-shaped decorations on top of them.
So the significance here is that in the 1967 trial, the defense could point out this discrepancy. Valentine described illuminated butterfly lights, which didn't match the car.
Right. But then, when the case goes to the 1976 retrial, almost 10 years later, Patricia Valentine changes her description to accurately match the aluminum decorative butterfly shape on Carter's car.
This shift it's deeply suspicious. It suggests that the testimony had been molded over time to fit the known evidence, and that completely undermines its credibility. So beyond these shifting eyewitness accounts, the investigation was just plagued by forensic and procedural failures. The most damning fact, for me, is the total lack of forensic linkage.
Zero evidence. No fingerprints, no blood, no fibers, nothing that ever linked Carter or Artis to the victims or the bar itself.
And on top of that, the lead detective, a Captain DeSimone, he later provided this flimsy excuse that there was insufficient time to administer gun residue tests, a common procedure even at the time.
It's unbelievable. Initially, Carter and Artis were released after 17 hours of interrogation. They had passed initial lie detector tests. They even voluntarily appeared before a grand jury, which, based on the evidence at the time, found no case to answer. They were free.
So how did they end up indicted months later? This is the point where prosecutorial pressure and these compromised witnesses just intersect perfectly.
Once the police realized Bello was involved in a theft and was a lookout, they had leverage over him. Bello changed his story and identified Artis. Then his accomplice, Arthur Bradley, came forward and identified Carter as the second attacker.
So it was solely based on the identification by Bello, a thief and an admitted liar, and Bradley, his accomplice, that the two men were rearrested and indicted.
And Bello allegedly expected a substantial reward for this identification, $10,500, though the sources indicate he was never actually paid. But that potential reward seriously compromised the integrity of his testimony from the start.
And then there's the issue of the physical evidence, the stuff supposedly found in the impounded rental car. Now remember, Carter and Artis were released, and the car was impounded. It was 5 days after their release that a detective reported finding 2 unfired rounds, a .32 caliber, and a 12 gauge inside the car.
During a secondary search.
A secondary, highly belated search.
The procedural failure here, it just screams manipulation. I mean, if these rounds were crucial evidence, why weren't they discovered during the initial thorough search? And why were Carter and Artis released if the police already had this potential linkage evidence?
The defense just tore this apart. They pointed out that the rounds didn't even match those used to kill the victims. The .32 round was brass instead of copper. The shotgun shell was an older model with a completely different wad and color.
It just introduced this serious doubt that these rounds were genuinely found in the car at the time of the stop. It really suggests they were possibly planted later.
So despite the defense, which was led by the distinguished attorney Raymond A. Brown, presenting strong alibi witnesses who placed Carter and Artis at the Night Spot bar at the time of the shootings,
And despite highlighting all these glaring inconsistencies,
the all-white jury convicted both men of first-degree murder.
the conviction did include a recommendation of mercy, which prevented the death penalty. Judge Samuel Larner sentenced Carter to 2 consecutive life sentences and Artis to 3 concurrent life sentences. The verdict, delivered in 1967, felt to many like a devastating miscarriage of justice, especially given the overwhelming lack of credible, unbiased evidence.
So after that conviction, the case went quiet for several years. The initial appeals failed. But then, around 1974, the tide really begins to turn, and it's largely driven by the conscience of the original witnesses.
That's right. Both Alfred Bellow and Arthur Bradley withdrew their identifications of Carter and Artis. This was an absolute bombshell.
It should have ended it right there.
It should have. It was the foundation for a motion for a new trial. But the initial reaction from the judicial system was just resistance. Judge Samuel Larner, who was the original trial judge, denied the motion in December of 1974.
And his reasoning was just so dismissive. He stated the recantations simply lacked the ring of truth.
The system refused to believe the very people it had relied upon to secure the conviction years earlier. It's astounding.
And this judicial obstinacy is what truly ignited the public campaign. The case moved out of the narrow confines of the courtroom, and it became a cultural phenomenon.
It really did. George Lois, a major advertising executive, he organized a high-profile public campaign, and the support crossed into major celebrity circles.
Muhammad Ali.
Boxer Muhammad Ali publicly voiced his support, wished Carter luck on his appeal, and he did it during an appearance on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, in September 1973. An endorsement from a global icon like that, it instantly broadened the case's reach.
But the single greatest cultural intervention, the one that solidified Carter's status as a symbol of injustice, was the music.
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, along with Jacques Levy, co-wrote and performed the song Hurricane in 1975, which explicitly and passionately proclaimed Carter's innocence. That song was inescapable.
It was. And the sources confirmed the impact of Dylan's commitment. He didn't just write a song. He performed it live at Trenton State Prison on December 7, 1975, where Carter was temporarily housed. This act transformed Carter from a convicted murderer in the eyes of the law into a political prisoner, a cause célèbre in the public consciousness.
Right. But as history always shows, public campaigns can raise awareness, but freedom is usually secured by legal victories. And the key turning point came from exposing what is known as a Brady violation.
And for our listeners, we should probably clarify what that means. The Brady Rule, it stems from a 1963 Supreme Court case, Brady v. Maryland, and it establishes that prosecutors have a constitutional obligation to disclose any evidence that is favorable to the accused.
So that means exculpatory evidence or evidence that could impeach the credibility of a government witness.
Exactly. And the fact that the prosecution in 1967 did not disclose information about deals they had made with their key witnesses, that was a profound violation of due process.
And this violation was uncovered during the recantation hearing. Defense attorneys argued that Bellow and Bradley had minimized the incentives they received from prosecutors back in 1967 in exchange for their testimony.
And they had a tape. The defense played a detective's 1966 tape of Bellow's interrogation, which revealed promises and potential deals that went far beyond what Bellow had ever admitted on the stand.
That was the smoking gun.
It was. It meant the prosecution had failed on 2 fundamental levels. Either they knowingly withheld exculpatory evidence about the witness's motivations, that's the Brady violation, or they stood by silently while their witnesses lied under oath about the inducements they received, which is, equally damning.
And this legal failure, it was so fundamental that it just couldn't be ignored. The New Jersey Supreme Court unanimously agreed. They ruled that the evidence of various deals made between the prosecution and witnesses should have been disclosed to the defense.
And the reasoning was crystal clear. That information was vital because it could have affected the jury's evaluation of the credibility of the prosecution's star witnesses.
Justice Mark Sullivan emphasized that the defendant's right to a fair trial was substantially prejudiced. This was a major unanimous rebuke of the prosecution's tactics.
And based on this, the court set aside the original convictions. Carter and Artis were granted a new trial a decade after the crime. This decision affirmed that the first trial was constitutionally flawed from the start.
So, with that previous conviction vacated, the prosecutor, Burl Ives Humphreys, he decides to retry the 10-year-old case. But the whole basis for the reversal was the unreliability of the witnesses. So Humphreys tries to sort of inoculate Alfred Bellow's testimony using polygraph examinations.
Right. He has Bellow polygraphed twice by two recognized experts, Leonard H. Harrelson and Richard Arthur. And both experts ultimately concluded that Bellow was telling the truth when he claimed he saw Carter outside the Lafayette bar immediately after the murders. The prosecution felt they had reinforced their star witness.
But here is where that concept of concealment just raises its head again, and the legal analysis becomes intensely nuanced.
It does. The sources reveal that Harrelson, one of the polygraph experts, also reported orally that Bellow had actually been inside the bar at the time of the shooting.
Which is a massive contradiction.
A huge contradiction.
Yeah?
Bellow's 1967 testimony stated he was on the street acting as a lookout when he saw the men flee. If he was inside the bar, his story about being a lookout falls apart, and his account of seeing the men escape changes entirely.
And while Harrelson's subsequent written report conveniently supported Bellow's 1967 testimony as truthful, that oral contradiction about his physical location.
That was crucial evidence that the defense should have received under Brady. It represented another ongoing failure of disclosure, and it was setting the stage for the next legal fight.
Okay, so let's move into the 1976 retrial. The atmosphere was completely different. There's massive public scrutiny, but the state is just determined to secure a second conviction.
And Alfred Bellow, despite his recantations, despite the polygraph controversies and the exposure of the undisclosed deals, he returns to the stand and repeats his original 1967 testimony, identifying both Carter and Artis.
But Arthur Bradley, Bellow's accomplice, who had identified Carter in the first trial.
He refused to cooperate this time. He did not testify, which left the state relying almost exclusively on Bellow and the increasingly questionable testimony of Patricia Valentine.
Meanwhile, the defense is armed now with the knowledge of the Brady violation, and they mount a highly rigorous defense. They present multiple alibi witnesses who place Carter in locations far away from the Lafayette Bar and Grill at the time of the murders.
Yeah, and the defense focused heavily on attacking the state's key witnesses. They highlighted the inconsistencies in Patricia Valentine's evolving description of the car's taillights, the fact that the description only accurately matched Carter's car detail in the later trial.
Which strongly suggested that her memory was either coached or, polluted over the years.
Absolutely. They also brought in the 1967 testimony of the deceased witness, Willie Marins, the survivor who was blinded in one eye. The defense read Marins' original descriptions of the shooters to the jury.
And what did they show?
It showed stark differences between those descriptions and the actual appearances of Carter and Artis. This was crucial for demonstrating doubt without having Marins on the stand for the jury to observe.
And to add to this already volatile atmosphere, there was testimony from a Carter associate who claimed that Passaic County prosecutors had tried to pressure her into testifying against Carter.
An allegation the prosecutors firmly denied. And investigator Fred Hogan, who had worked to secure the recantations, also testified, denying under cross-examination that any bribes were offered to Bellow to change his story back in 1974.
So despite all this, despite the compelling defense strategy, the exposure of the prosecutorial misconduct in the first trial, and the highly questionable state witnesses, the jury, after almost 9 hours of deliberation, again found Carter and Artis guilty of first-degree murder.
It was a shocking moment for the advocates. Judge Leah Pizzi reimposed the exact same sentences. Double life for Carter, single life for Artis. And while John Artis was eventually released on parole in 1981, Carter remained incarcerated, enduring a state appeal system that just seemed determined to uphold the conviction.
And the New Jersey Supreme Court affirmed Carter's conviction in 1982, though it was a very close 4-3 decision.
It was. And the majority even acknowledged the legal failure we discussed earlier. They agreed that the prosecutors should have disclosed the polygraph expert Harrelson's oral opinion, the one that suggested Bellow was inside the bar.
But they didn't think it mattered.
Exactly. Here's the crucial legal distinction the majority made. They concluded that this failure to disclose that specific contradiction was not material under the Brady disclosure law.
In simple terms, they didn't believe that single piece of evidence was strong enough to have changed the outcome of the 1976 verdict.
Right. The state system had reviewed the case, acknowledged flaws, but ultimately upheld the conviction. Carter was out of options at the state level.
We should pause here just briefly to note a difficult episode that really complicated Carter's public image. This was during the brief period when he was released on bail in 1976 between the trials.
Yes, this led to a significant loss of public support. The bail bondswoman, Carolyn Kelly, who had helped raise the funds for his release, claimed Carter had severely beaten her over a dispute about a hotel bill while they were on a fundraising trip.
And this accusation was reported by the Philadelphia Daily News.
It was, and while Carter denied the accusation, the public impact was immediate and destructive. That celebrity support, which had been so vital, it quickly eroded.
And a judge actually ruled on it.
He did. A Passaic County judge, William Marchese, held a hearing in July 1976 and determined the assault had occurred, and he changed the terms of Carter's bail. Kelly ultimately declined to pursue criminal charges, stating she believed Carter needed treatment, not more jail time. But regardless of the legal outcome, the damage to the campaign's moral authority was done.
So, with the state system failing him multiple times, Carter's legal team turned to the ultimate recourse, the federal court system. In 1985, they filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus.
And for the listener, this is fundamentally an appeal to the federal government. You're asking the court, is the state holding this person illegally in violation of their constitutional rights?
And U.S. District Court Judge H. Lee Sarakin, he reviewed the totality of the case, the 2 trials, the shifting testimonies, the undisclosed deals, and he delivered an absolutely scathing decision. He granted the writ and set aside the convictions.
Sorokin's language was not just critical, it was explosive. He determined that the entire prosecution over 2 trials had been, and this is a quote, predicated upon an appeal to racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure.
That's an incredible statement from a federal judge.
It's a foundational condemnation. He's stating that racial bias and ethical failures were built into the very core of the state's case against a black man accused of murdering 3 white people in the highly charged atmosphere of the 1960s.
And that ruling was the moment of freedom. Carter, now 48 years old, was released without bail in November 1985. The immediate legal battle did continue, however.
It did. The state prosecutors appealed Sorokin's powerful ruling to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, but the appellate court upheld the opinion. Specifically, they affirmed Sorokin's Brady analysis regarding the systemic withholding of evidence that could have aided the defense.
The prosecutors made one final effort. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court,
which declined to hear the case in 1988. This rejection confirmed the finality of the federal judicial review. The state had no further legal avenues to pursue the conviction.
So facing the prospect of a third trial almost 22 years after the crime, the state finally capitulated. In 1988, New Jersey Attorney General W. Carey Edwards and acting Passaic County Prosecutor John P. Gusseljack filed a motion to dismiss the indictments.
And their rationale was that it was, and I quote, just not legally feasible to sustain a prosecution and not practical after almost 22 years to be trying anyone.
And they cited Alfred Bellow's current unreliability.
The same witness they had spent 2 decades defending in court. The judge granted the motion, officially ending the legal nightmare and formally declaring Rubin Carter an exonerated man.
So, following his exoneration, Rubin Carter moves to Canada. He settles in Toronto, eventually becomes a Canadian citizen. And his life immediately shifts into his second major act, advocacy.
Initially, his transition to freedom was complex. He lived in a Toronto commune with some of his advocates, but he later expressed that even this environment felt restrictive. He claimed it felt like another prison, which suggests how institutionalized his life had become.
And his personal relationships remained complicated as well.
It did. He married Lisa Peters, a relationship that lasted 6 years, though the sources note he claimed the marriage was never physically consummated.
But his professional legacy in the latter half of his life is so profoundly dedicated to justice. From 1993 to 2005, he served as the executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, or AWIC,
which is now known as Innocence Canada. And this was not a ceremonial position. He was running a major organization dedicated to preventing others from suffering his fate.
And his approach to advocacy was as fierce and uncompromising as his boxing style.
Absolutely. His dedication was total, even leading to a significant internal conflict within AWIC. In 2005, he resigned because the association declined to support his protest of the appointment of Susan McLean to a judgeship.
Right, and to understand the gravity of this, we need the context. McLean was the prosecutor of a Canadian man named Guy Paul Morin,
who served over 18 months in prison before being exonerated by DNA evidence. So for Carter, the appointment of a prosecutor linked to a high-profile case of wrongful conviction was an unforgivable ethical failure. He viewed it as an institutional betrayal of the principles he spent his life fighting for, and he stepped down rather than compromise his moral stance.
Beyond his executive role, he traveled extensively, serving as a powerful motivational speaker.
Yeah.
He truly leveraged his personal tragedy into inspiration.
And his dedication to this cause was recognized academically. In 2005, he received 2 honorary doctorates of law from both York University and Griffith University, specifically for his monumental work with AWIC and the Global Innocence Project Network.
Carter's story, of course, had already left this indelible cultural footprint. I mean, that was instrumental in generating the initial pressure for a retrial. His autobiography, The 16th Round, written while he was still incarcerated, was published back in 1974.
And we can't overstate the importance of Bob Dylan's 1975 song, Hurricane. It became an anthem of injustice, raising awareness across generations and borders. Carter actually appeared as himself in Dylan's unusual 1978 movie, Ronaldo and Clara, further blending the reality of his struggle with his cultural mythos.
And then the 1999 feature film The Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington, really solidified his narrative in popular history. It brought the details of the accusation, the trials, the long imprisonment to a massive global audience.
Washington's powerful portrayal was highly acclaimed. He won the Golden Globe Award for Best Actor, got nominated for an Academy Award.
And for those seeking even more detail, his story was recently explored in The Hurricane Tapes, a 2019 BBC series based on extensive case notes and 40 hours of recorded interviews Carter gave to an author named Ken Klonsky. His life truly crossed the boundaries of sports, law, culture, and activism.
The final, most poignant chapter of his life is perhaps the greatest testament to his commitment. In March 2012, Carter was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. Doctors gave him only a few months to live.
And this is a powerful detail. John Otis, his lifelong friend and co-accused who had been paroled earlier, he lived with and cared for Carter in his final months in Toronto.
Even as he was dying, Carter was focused on fighting injustice for others. Just 2 months before he passed away, in February 2014, he published an opinion piece in the New York Daily News titled Hurricane Carter's Dying Wish.
His final public request.
It was for an independent review of the conviction of David McCallum, a Brooklyn man who had been jailed since 1985.
And Carter directly linked McCallum's case to his own. He used Judge Sorokin's exact phrasing from 1985, writing that McCallum's verdict, like his own, was predicated on racism rather than reason and on concealment rather than disclosure. He was calling upon the system to correct the failures he knew so intimately.
And the powerful final consequence of his advocacy is this. David McCallum was exonerated on October 15, 2014, just months after Carter's death. It was the ultimate posthumous fulfillment of his final request for justice.
Rubin Carter died on April 20, 2014, at the age of 76, leaving behind a legacy that transcended the brutality of the boxing ring and the injustice of the prison system. John Artis, his loyal friend and co-accused, passed away several years later in 2021.
So as we conclude this examination of the extensive source material surrounding Rubin Hurricane Carter, what stands out most sharply is the complexity and, frankly, the cruelty of systemic failure. The central lessons are rooted in legal ethics and constitutional rights.
The profound impact of withheld evidence, those blatant Brady violations that tainted not one but both state trials.
The case serves as such a powerful historical example of the necessity of federal oversight. The New Jersey state system acknowledged flaws, but ultimately upheld the convictions. It took the intervention of a federal judge, H. Lee Sorokin, who was willing to use language like racism rather than reason and concealment rather than disclosure to overturn a conviction that had survived 2 trials and numerous state appeals.
It corrected a fundamental due process failure.
Absolutely.
Carter's entire life was defined by fights, inside and outside the ropes. But the enduring power of his story really lies in his transformation, from a victim of injustice to a relentless advocate for others.
Yeah, his ability to take the profound trauma of 18 years of wrongful imprisonment and channel that rage and that knowledge into fighting for people like David McCallum, literally to his dying day, is remarkable.
And this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to contemplate. For a person like Rubin Carter, who experienced the worst kind of institutional failure, his journey raises an important question. How does the lived experience of profound injustice become a necessary, maybe even an indispensable foundation for effective future advocacy?
How does the fight change when, without a doubt, the true cost of the system's failure?
We appreciate you joining us for this thorough examination of the sources related to the life and case of Rubin Hurricane Carter.
Thanks for listening.